Okay, so good morning. Thank you for coming back. You always worry when you teach the first week if people are coming back the second week. So thank you for that. So on Thursday night, my son texts me and says, "Hey, can we get together for dinner?" I'm like, "Okay." And I show up to dinner, and his wife is with him. I'm like, "Okay, great. I get like both my kids for dinner." I'm like, "So what's the occasion?" And they're like, "Well, my wife is out of town for the week." And they're like, "We just want to make sure that you're okay." I was like, "Clearly you do not know me that well." I think I told this story before, but in the Mistily family, you have the Apostle Paul at the top of the hierarchy, then Billy Graham, and then Josh McDowell. And I had the opportunity one time, thrill of my lifetime, to take Josh McDowell on a boat trip up to the San Juans. So it was my wife and Josh McDowell and his wife Dottie. And he's looking out over the San Juans and he goes, "This is kind of like heaven. But my view of heaven is it's a library with millions of books and a big table, and I can just get all of eternity to just study in peace and quiet." And Dottie says, "That's your idea of heaven? That's my idea of hell." So since I know my wife is watching, I love you, I miss you terribly, but having a week to just study and read books and do whatever you want is not a bad thing. Okay, so last week we talked about creation and a couple of pieces of archaeological evidence for creation. As I think I spent last year talking about, we don't really know when creation happened, big debate, somewhere around, let's say, 10,000 to 50,000 years ago in terms of BC. And now we're going to kind of skip 10 generations, according to the Bible. That's assuming they didn't skip some generations in there. But 10 generations, and we get to probably around 3,000 to 5,000 BC. Okay, just to put that in perspective, Moses shows up at about 1500 BC. So we're talking about twice the long from Christ to Moses to where we are in terms of Noah's Ark. And we see a lot's changed in the world, right? We know from creation, God creates the earth. He creates it a wonderful place. Adam and Eve sin. There's consequences to that sin. And then we end up here in Genesis chapter 6. I did hand out the passage for those of you who don't want to look up the passage. I'm not going to read every verse, but I want to hit the highlights. So this is Genesis 6 verse 5. I'm sorry, 6 verse 12. "And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them all on the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. And this is how you are to make it." And he goes into the archaeological plans. And verse 17, "Behold, I will bring flood waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. And everything on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark. You, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort of the ark and keep them alive with you. And they shall be male and female. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded. And Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his son's wife with them went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood." In verse 17, "The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark. And it rose high above the earth, and the waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. And the ark floated above the waters of the earth. And the waters prevailed so mightily that the earth and all the high mountains and the whole heaven were covered." And then 21, "And all flesh that moved on the earth, birds, living livestock, beasts, swarming creatures that swarm the earth, all mankind, everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died." And then it says in verse 1, chapter, 8, "But God remembered Noah and the beasts of the livestock that were there with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. And on the 7th month and on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to a rest on the mountains of Ararat." Okay, so I'm guessing most people know this story. I was taught it probably in, 2nd grade or 3rd grade or something like that whenever I was in Sunday school class. And it's a horrible story to teach kids. Like, I don't know why we like teach this story. Like, you have these pictures in the nursery of Noah and the ark and all the animals, because I guess it's a cute story. But like, God destroying the entire earth and everything in it is kind of like a tough message. The question is this, right? And that is, this is a crazy story, right? That God decides to destroy the entire earth, and he tells one guy to build an ark, and basically, I'm going to save you, I'm going to destroy everything on the earth. How does one guy living 3,000 to 5,000 years ago build an ark of the dimensions that are given? Just put this in perspective, we're talking about 450 feet long. That is a very long boat. That's like half a freighter, a modern freighter. Very large, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. Very large kind of vessel that you would kind of see on Puget Sound today. So how do we know this is true? Because it sounds very fanciful. And I remember when I went to summer camp, there was a guy named Bob Lutz, and he was talking through the story. And I'll never forget the way he kind of presented it, because he kind of like put yourself in the first person. And God says, okay, Noah, I want you to build an ark, build it of gopher wood, blah, 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 blah. And Noah says, okay, got it. I want to be obedient. Got it. God, what's an ark? And God goes, well, it's a big boat. Noah goes, okay, got it. What's a boat? And God's like, it's something that floats. He goes, okay, got it. Next question, what is gopher wood? I've never heard of gopher wood. God's like, oh, okay, well, Hebrew, no, there's no punctuation, there's no vowels. I mean, go for wood. So, just go get some wood, build the ark. He's like, okay, got it. Next question. You told me to build it like 300 cubits by 200 cubits. What's a cubit? God's like, this is going to take some time, I see. Noah's like, well, how much time do I got? And God's like, well, given the way this is going, at least 100 years. And Noah's like, okay, one final question, God, one final question. Where's the nearest Home Depot? I mean, you think about this story, it's kind of absurd, right? I mean, this guy in like literally somewhere where there's like no ocean, probably in Iraq, as best we can kind of pick, Mesopotamia region, is told to build this massive ship, right? Probably bigger than anything that's ever been built in the humankind at that point. So what evidence do we have that this thing ever happened? And I want to talk about kind of the archaeological evidence, because it's kind of impressive. How do we know this story is true? Because no other story in the Bible has as much extra-biblical evidence as Noah's flood. No other story in the Bible has as much extra-biblical support than Noah's flood. There are more than 300 different flood accounts from around the world. Every culture, almost, every continent has a flood story. Now, I want you to think about this. It's okay to say every, people group of the world have a creation story. Like, how did God create us? Okay, that makes sense, right? But like a flood where God floods the earth and like kills everybody and there's a guy who floats away on a boat. Like, almost every civilization we know of has a flood story. And they are surprisingly consistent between them. More than what you would expect to see. So I want to go through some of the evidence that we have, if my computer is cooperating, which it is not. That's a problem. How's that? Okay. So we have evidence, and we kind of, like I said, take these 300 flood accounts. You can lay them next to each other. And this is what you see, and this is what's fascinating to me. 95% of all the flood accounts that we have, again, almost every culture, almost every ancient civilization we know of on every continent says the flood was global. 95% agree the flood was global. 95% of the accounts say it was only a flood, as opposed to like an earthquake and a flood put together or something like that. 95% it was only a flood. 88% there was a favored family that was selected by God. You have 73%, did animals play a part? Meaning, did animals get rescued along with the humans? 70%, the survival was due to a boat. God said, build a boat. 73% of the stories have that in the story. 66% they were 66%, they were forewarned. 2/3, the flood was due to the wickedness of mankind. Not an accident, not just it rained a lot. 2/3 because of the wickedness of mankind. 57% did the survivors land on a mountain. 35% were birds sent out as part of the story. 13% did they offer a sacrifice. 9% were there specific 8 people mentioned in the story. And then 7% was there a rainbow at the end. Okay, so why is this significant? It's significant because anthropologists will tell you when you have similar stories across different cultures, there's a typical, ancestor to the story, right? And it gets passed down to generation to different cultures. Here's a case where you have almost every culture of the world has a story that looks very similar. What does that mean? It means, from anthropologists, they would argue, it's all descended from one story, which is exactly what we have in the Bible, right? If there really was a Noah, I guarantee his kids told their kids, and their kids, and their kids, and so on. This is exactly what you would expect. It's such a significant story that as they get dispersed after the Tower of Babel, they get dispersed around the world, this story gets repeated. And of course, it gets changed. You'll see in many of the stories there's multiple gods, right? Cultures embrace multiple gods. They bring that into the story. But the fact that it's so consistent is truly amazing. And we don't have anything else like this in the Bible where so many cultures share the same story. But I want to walk through a couple of these. There we go. The first is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, 1860, a British researcher named George Smith is checking out the British Museum. So he's in Britain, going in the British Museum, one of the dark storerooms, and he discovers a bunch of these 4,000-year-old clay tablets dating back to ancient Babylon, and starts to recognize some themes in the stories to Israelite kings, and starts to piece together something pretty amazing. Now you gotta understand, British Empire conquered the world. They took a whole bunch of artifacts, kind of pillaged the ancient cultures, brought them back to Britain, and they primarily were looking for like riches and treasures. They weren't really looking at clay tablets. So this is why the clay tablets are sitting in some back storeroom in the British Museum. So this guy starts to recognize what he's got, and then he goes to Nineveh. Nineveh is now modern-day Mosul, Iraq. Nineveh does some more researching and discovers the rest of the tablets. And he discovers probably one of the most significant stories of the ancient culture. And the reason this is significant is because this is like the John Grisham novel of the ancient time. It doesn't just show up in Babylon. It shows up in Samaria, Mesopotamia, Egypt. This thing, the Epic of Gilgamesh, gets rewritten, repeated over and over and over again. So it ends up a very popular story. And it's basically the story of this guy named Gilgamesh, who basically is looking for the secret to immortality. Gilgamesh is a known king. We see his name show up in other places. He's looking for basically the secret to immortality. Somebody says, hey, you should go talk to Utnapishtim. And basically, he's immortal, he survived the flood, go talk to him. So this is, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the story about him basically seeking out this wise old person. This is dated 700 years prior to Abraham. So this is before Abraham is where the story is popping up. And like I said, Gilgamesh is mentioned. The interesting thing is, many people, Gilgamesh in the writings is described as a warrior and a builder, which has many parallels in the Bible to Nimrod. In the book of Genesis, it gives us some description of Nimrod, who built the Tower of Babel, or led the building of the Tower of Babel, who's also described as a hunter, he's described as a builder, also a very evil guy. So some people draw parallels between Gilgamesh and him, and then they draw the parallels to this wise person who survived the flood as Noah, because this guy is a descendant, and we're not too many years between Moses and where we are with Utnapishtim. So the epic is basically about this search for this immortality and how he survived it. But the wise old sage basically then recounts the story of the flood. So the story of Gilgamesh basically records the flood epic and what happened, right? If the guy survived the flood, the story goes, he basically recounted it to our friend Gilgamesh. And the parallels are quite stark, right? And this is what George Smith discovered as he was kind of piecing this together. Very much parallels the biblical epic, right? The flood was divinely planned. It was connected to sinfulness of mankind. There was a divine revelation to the hero, which basically said, we're going to bring this disaster upon the earth. A ship gets built. The family and the hero are saved. All the living creatures are put on board. The storm brings the flood. Everybody on the ship is saved. The duration of the flood is specified. The ship lands on a mountain. Birds are sent out. Sacrifice is offered. And then our hero offers a blessing. So very similar to the story of the biblical story. Now, again, this is Babylon. This is not Hebrew. This is not Christian. This is a story that shows up in Babylon. Now, there are some differences, right? The biblical story, there's one God. In the Babylonian story, there's multiple gods, so it's polytheistic. We see in the case of Genesis, it's mankind's corruption. That's why God destroys it. Gilgamesh says he's angry. It doesn't say necessarily why, but he's angry at mankind for some reason. And then we obviously have some other stories. In the Bible, the ark is a rectangle. In fact, I took nautical engineering in college, which is a wonderful class. I loved it. But like you'll notice freighters all kind of have the same dimensions for the most part, right? They're kind of all rectangular and long. And anyway, the one in Gilgamesh is a square cube. So not seagoing or seafaring, or doesn't adhere to our modern idea of nautical engineering, but Noah's ship does. Noah actually has the same dimensions as most of what you would think of as a modern ship. Anything that's got 400 feet long would have similar dimensions in our day and age. So there's additional differences, but again, think about the similarities. What are the odds that two epics show up at the same time, describe similar events, and even to the point where birds are sent out to see if there's dry land? No question that these stories descended from a common person, which again in the Bible, clearly Noah would tell his children, etc. Again, we're 700 years, 600, 700 years before Abraham, which is 400 or 500 years before Moses and the invention of writing. So this is all kind of transmitted verbally at this point in terms of what we have. Okay, so a couple others. Like I said, there's hundreds of these. This is not the only one. This is the Atrahasis epic. And this one basically tells a very similar story, discovered in 1872. Like Gilgamesh, humans have displeased the gods. The god warns them of a coming flood. The gods instruct him how to survive. He builds a boat and saves mankind, and he saves all of the animals. And then another famous one is the Urdu epic. This is a Sumerian version of the story. It dates to about 1600 BC, and basically very similar. God instructs the hero in the story, which is Ziudura, to build a very large boat. There's a 7-day storm. The Bible describes a 40-day storm. But then he saves the animals, then offers a sacrifice when he gets done. So again, very interesting evidence. If you say, what's the evidence of Noah's Ark? I could talk about geology. We could talk about what we know of in terms of fossils on mountains or whatever. But the archaeological evidence that almost every culture has these stories is very powerful to argue this thing really happened. Right? This is a shared story that was passed down from generation to generation following, obviously, the biblical story of Noah and the flood. But there is more, not so much about the flood story, but this one I found fascinating. This is called the Sumerian Kings List. This is a list of Sumerian kings. Okay, so this dates to about 2000 BC. So we're talking about 500 years before Moses. And it's fascinating because it doesn't describe the flood. What it describes is a list of kings from Sumeria and how long they lived. And what's very interesting is it parallels the Genesis account. If you've studied the Bible, you know the lifespan of people before the flood is very different than the lifespan of people after the flood. Before the flood, you had some people approaching 1,000 years old. They frequently lived, as you saw in the text. Noah was 500 years old when he got his thing from God, 600 years after the ark, and then we don't know how long he lived after that. So we're talking 500, 600, 700 years. Our friend Methuselah lived almost 1,000 years. Kind of crazy lengths of people's lives. But then God says, I'm going to limit the lives to 120 years, post-flood. Right? It's a fascinating study. But the interesting thing about the Sumerian kings list, this is not a Christian document. It gives the lives of kings pre-flood and the lives of kings post-flood. And what you see is there's a sum total in terms of the ages pre-flood, average about 24,000 years each in terms of length, which is crazy. Everyone's kind of discounted this. Following the flood, they go down to about 1,000 years each. Again, still crazy, kind of unbelievable. People didn't understand this. People just wrote this off of, oh, these guys are crazy. But it turns out the Sumerians, their numbering system is base 60. Ours is base 10. You ever wondered why the clock over here has 60 divisions on it? 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour? Sumerians were the ones who invented it, folks, because they used a base 60 system, not a base 100 or a base 10, right? That's why we don't have 100 divisions on our clock or 10 divisions on the clock. It's because these guys. So you translate those, base 60 to base 10, different numbering system, fine. What do you end up with? You end up with lifespans for the Sumerian kings that typically range between 600, 700, 800, 900 years pre-flood, and then date to about 100 years post-flood. Not Christian, this is Sumerian. So it sounds ridiculous that God shortened the lifespan of humans, but we have other evidence from other cultures. This is exactly what happened. That the lifespans before the flood were much longer than they were post-flood. So I think it's fascinating, this long, short kind of pattern that we see in terms of the Sumerian kings list, because again, it very much validates what happened in terms of the flood accounts. Okay, so all that's great. Flood happened, a lot of stories about it. We have some confirmation. The most interesting question I find is what happened to the ark, right? What happened to Noah's ark? All we know from the story is Genesis 8, verse 4, which says, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. That's all we get. And that's the last time it's ever mentioned in the Bible. 450-foot long ship just kind of disappears from the Bible. Okay, but fine, I get it. It's possible Noah used it for firewood, right? They tore it apart, used it for firewood. That's good timber. It's also possible, I suppose, that they tore it apart and used it for houses. Except for one problem. It's up in the mountains. Very unlikely he hung out in the mountains, right? The mountains of Ararat, very snow-capped, very, cold. My guess is they kind of left and went into more fertile ground where they could grow crops and things like that. So very likely you didn't tear it apart or burn it or something like that. The interesting thing is this. As I did the research on this, there's been a lot of stories about sightings of the ark. More than 60 different eyewitnesses have claimed they've climbed up to the ark, they've seen the ark, they've been in the ark, things like that. More than 200 different stories over history. More than 60 people said they actually entered the ark and brought back potential pieces of the ark. And I want to go through some of these because I think it's fascinating because again, and I'll kind of explain at the end why. 300 BC, so this is before Christ. 300 years before Christ, Babylonian high priest named Berosus reported that the ark could still be seen and that people scraped pitch from the ship to make amulets. Kathy showed me her necklace, which is kind of a piece of kind of archaeological history. Same thing here, right? They would go up there, they'd scrape it and create little amulets because they thought it was good luck in terms of carrying it around and then I assume selling it on the market and things like that. Nicholas of Damascus, so this is 64 BC, so this is contemporaneous with Christ. Biographer of Herod the Great. The guy wrote 94 books. documenting all the great stuff that Herod did, which is probably why we call him Herod the Great, because there's a lot of writing about this guy. He said the timber and the relics were still visible at the time. Josephus, which is probably the most credible historian of the time, Jewish historian, writes, quote, "The ark landed on the mountains in Armenia. The Armenians call the spot the landing place, and they show the relics of it even to this day." And then in the Christian world, John Chrysostom, if I pronounced that right, very well-known patriarch of Constantinople, said, quote, "Do not the mountains of Armenia attest to it, where the ark is rested, and not all the remains of the ark are preserved there to this day for your admonition." What he's saying is basically, if you don't believe the story, go climb a mountain. You can go see it, right? That's what he's saying. He's using it as an apologetic. In the medieval period, we see more stories. Marco Polo, very famous explorer, basically wrote in his book on the travels, he said, "The Ark of Noah still rests on top of a certain great mountain where the snow stays so long that no one can climb it." And then Jans Strays in 1670 took a wooden cross from the ark from a monk who basically gave it to him and said, "This is from the ark," carved it out, and that still sits in a church. I believe it's in France today. And then as we kind of go through time, getting a little bit more current, we have in the 19th century, Sir James Bryce, he did a solo ascent and returned with a 4-foot-long piece of the ark, which was then subjected to carbon dating and dates back to ancient times. We don't really know exactly when the flood was, but we know that the piece of wood he brought back goes back thousands of years. And then the Turkish government in 1883 basically announced that they had discovered the ark, and this ended up in newspapers around the world. 20th century, we have George Hanokian. He climbed the ark and basically documented what he saw. And then a Russian aviator in 1916 basically observed it on a military flight, documented it, and that's in kind of the Russian records. So, okay, got it. And then if you go more modern, you end up in like 1955, a French explorer took a hand-cut piece out of the ark, brought it back. But again, I want to see video footage, right? Don't you? Like, I want to see, you know, Geraldo or whatever the modern equivalent is, right? Joe Rogan, I guess, these days. Go into the ark, you know, take pictures, big photographs, things like that. And okay, so the question then is, you know, more recently. The fascinating thing is more recently, all the evidence or all the research is around what is called the Durnapar site. This is on the mountains of Ararat. There's been a lot of news the last couple years about this site. What you see here is what people kind of suspect may be the ark. It's about the right length, the right dimensions in terms of the proportions. And there's been really 3 areas of study. One is pottery fragments. They've been able to take pottery fragments from the ark. They've dated it back to about 5000 BC. Now, the researchers will say this doesn't prove that this is Noah's Ark. It just proves that there's pottery up there that dates back to 5000 BC, which, you know, makes total sense. Then there's geological sampling. There's marine fossils at the top of this mountain, which again doesn't prove anything. There's a bunch of marine fossils at the top of a bunch of different mountains. Part of that is the way that mountains get formed. Part of it is if you believe the actual story of Noah's flood, you would expect to find marine fossils pretty much everywhere. But we have fossil record from there. And then basically geophysical scanning. So Istanbul Technical University, Andrews University used what's called ground penetrating radar to basically look below the earth. And this is things, you know, buried, as you can see. And what they found was very interesting. You would expect to find basically nothing, but what you find are kind of straight lines in terms of basically, you know, cross beams, right, underneath the earth. You would not expect to find this in a natural geological formation. So again, we don't know for sure, but it's interesting, very interesting evidence. So why is it so hard to actually dig this up and find evidence, right? And I think there's probably, you know, 3 reasons for it. First of all, you know, there is no such thing as the mountain of Ararat. We tend to think of it as one mountain. It's actually a whole mountain chain. So think of it as like the Cascades. And the tallest peak, which is Bigarat, which is 17,000 feet tall. So put that in perspective, Mount Rainier is about 14,000 feet. So this is taller than Mount Rainier, and it's snow-covered almost all the time. There's other peaks. There's Bigarat, Little Arat. Little Arat's about 12,000 feet, so a little bit shorter than Mount Rainier. Snow melts on top of it. So if you're trying to do a geological dig, first of all, you got to get very high up. Second of all, it's covered with 200 feet of glacial ice almost all the time. So you're not just randomly going up there with the shovel and trying to dig is problem number one. The second problem is where this thing's located. Right, this thing is located literally at the intersection of 3 countries. The base of it touches all 3 countries. One is Turkey, one is Iran, and the other is the former Soviet state of Armenia. So not exactly the most friendly part of town that you're going to go digging in. There's been kind of near constant war in this area for centuries and centuries. Obviously, you don't want to be an American climbing in Iran or in Russia or something like that. So it's very hard to get kind of climbing permits, excavation permits, and things like that. And also worth pointing out, it's a volcano, right? Very similar to, say, Mount St. Helens. This thing, every once in a while, kind of spews up volcano stuff. So it's possible, again, this could be the site, it could be something else, but if you think about, I don't know, like 7,000, 8,000 years of history, this thing could be buried in ice. It could have been like glacier on top of it. It could have, volcanic rock on top of it. We just don't know. So the question is, from an archaeological point of view, this is very interesting in terms of, the find. And the reason is, and I want to kind of wrap up with a quote from Melville Grosvenor. This is the former editor-in-chief of National Geographic. And he says this, he says, if the Ark of Noah is ever discovered, it would be the greatest archaeological find in human history, the greatest event since the resurrection of Christ, and it would alter all current events in scientific thought. Why? It's because it would prove that the events of Genesis, especially chapters 1 through 11, which are so much criticized by modern scholars, it would prove them to be correct. There's a huge amount, I've studied a lot, obviously last year we talked about Genesis, this year obviously with Noah's Ark. There's a lot of academics that hate the idea that Genesis 1 through 11 could actually be history. So there's a lot of work trying to discredit it. And you'll see this as we kind of go through the subsequent weeks, as we talk about David and Solomon and people, the Exodus never happened. I watched a movie last night on the Exodus and did it happen or didn't happen. It's just amazing how much scholarship there is trying to discredit the Bible. If Noah's Ark were to show up, though, it would be an amazing find. Probably the biggest archaeological find in history because it would prove that Genesis 1 through 11 is real. We know the flood very likely happened given the stories. Did a guy actually build a boat? This most crazy, fanciful story. People, even Christians, it didn't really happen. I mean, I've named folks before that kind of discount the story and say, well, it's a parable. It's a metaphor. It didn't actually happen. The problem is it doesn't read like that in the Bible. You read the story, it goes through the lineage. Christ gives the genealogy from Adam all the way down to Christ. You see this in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke. The genealogies, they're not fake. They're designed to be real. It reads as a historical account. And that's why I think this is so fascinating. Again, I don't know if the Ark, if this is it, if it's somewhere else where it exists, but I do know from an archaeological point of view, God has a wonderful sense of humor. When people get to the point of saying, no, David and Solomon never existed, as we saw in the sort of 80s and 90s, it was very in vogue for folks to say David and Solomon never existed. We start to find evidence that they actually existed. We see, there's a ton of evidence around Moses didn't even know how to write. There was no such thing. And then all of a sudden, we find out that writing, the alphabet, gets invented where? It gets invented in the Sinai Peninsula right around 1450 BC, which is when the Exodus happens. So that's when we have our first records of people writing in the alphabet. So fascinating in terms of discoveries. That's why I think this is a wonderful topic. So let me stop there and ask for any questions. Yes, ma'am.
On the few slides back where you talk about
The Sumerian kings list.
Yeah. I wonder, has that been studied? Like, is Noah's name in between? Because you have the kings before the flood, thousands of years old, and then like after Noah. So how does that? Does Noah get inserted in the middle as part of the transition?
Yeah, so these are Sumerian kings, right? Noah was never a king, so there's no reference to kind of Hebrew people in this. But your question is very valid, and that's why a lot of people kind of question, okay, does this make sense, right? There were kings before the flood, there were kings after the flood. How did that happen? Well, we know there was a very large civilizations that existed pre-flood, right? We know there were probably very likely millions of people that are on the earth pre-flood. And then we end up with records post-flood. So, you know, how does it get documented pre-flood? Like, did Noah take it with him? Did his son, I mean, Samaria is not that far. Did they try and preserve records? I don't know the answer to that question, right? Obviously, it's not a continual dynasty. It just kind of lists out the kings pre-flood and post-flood. So it's a good question, though. Yeah?
Well, the post-flood kings, when did they start? Because you would think that if there were only the 8 people left and we had to repopulate the world, it's going to take them a long time to then have these other Sumerian kings post-flood.
Yeah, so that's a great question. They don't give us absolute dates. Of course, the Christian calendar isn't invented at this point. The Jewish calendar isn't invented at this point. It gives us the lengths of how long they were kings for. It doesn't give us the date they were kings. So anyway, it's a very good question. What we know is this, right? Pre-flood, very large civilizations, meaning, like I said, millions of people pre-flood. We also know post-flood, the earth started to get repopulated fairly quick because it was Noah's grandson who built the Tower of Babel to rally the peoples of the world. So this wasn't like 10 people on the earth at the time. Like, these people, like I said, procreated. God said, go have a bunch of kids. And if you do sort of the math and everyone has 10 kids or 15 kids or whatever, and then they all have 10 or 15 kids, it doesn't take very long to get to a very large population. So, and again, kings is an interesting word, right? Kings, back at that time, meant kind of a city-state, right? So if you had a city of hundreds of people, you'd be considered a king if you were in charge of it. So these weren't necessarily massive empires the size of Babylon or Egypt or something like that.
I have a question about the flood. It's supposedly killed all sinful man except 8 people. How did Gilgamesh survive? A tyrannical, godlike king, of Uruk. How did he survive the flood?
So Gilgamesh was after the flood. So he didn't survive the flood. He went seeking out the guy who survived the flood, which is probably either Noah or one of his grandsons in the story. So yeah, Gilgamesh did not survive it. Gilgamesh came after the flood. So he's seeking out the old Sherpa, the Yoda, if you will, trying to get answers to immortality.
Have there been any people who have actually gone to that area in recent years, like the last 40 years, to try to discover pieces of art? I knew someone at a former church about 35, 40 years ago whose husband and a group of men had wanted to go. Sounds like no, but are you aware of anybody actually going and doing a search?
Yeah, so the question, because I've been told to repeat the question for folks, people are nodding their head. The question is, have there been kind of recent expeditions to there? And the answer is yes. The most recent stuff I showed you, which is kind of the ground penetrating radar at this site, this is 2025. So this is very recent.
But does it have snow on it all the time?
Well, this is not the peak. This site is about 12 miles. Again, Arad is not one peak, it's a mountain range. This is one site that's been speculated, and it's not at 15,000 feet, right? So that's why you see the picture, and there's no, it's above tree line, you can see. There's no tree, well, there's some over here. But in general, like I said, there are times where this site is kind of melted. So yes, there's been a bunch of expeditions more recently. I'm kind of excited that, Who knows what's going to happen with Iran? But let's assume Iran gets toppled and we end up with friendly government. It's going to be a lot easier to do these kind of expeditions. Because right now you're not flying into Tehran and driving over here. You're also not flying really into Armenia on, the Russian side. And Turkey these days has gotten a little bit more hostile towards Westerners. So you don't want to be a white person stomping around Istanbul. So yeah, I think, like I said, I hope you're going to have a lot more expeditions. But the most recent ones that I talked about were all in 2025. So very recent. There is actual work going on in these sites. Yeah, see.
In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was a college study for many of us back in the day, they make a big deal about the whole story and being like everybody respected it. Over time, has people made these parallels that you pointed out to, that this is really, the story that you've been saying, or is it somehow so unpopular to go that direction that it always gets stifled?
Well, so what you'll see, and we talked a little bit about this last week, the difference between, what are called the minimalists, or the kind of the secular archaeologists, and the maximalists, which are more of the Christian archaeologists, right? So how do the minimalists explain the Epic of Gilgamesh? And the answer is, there was this, somebody made up this story, it's fiction, and a lot of civilizations copied it, and it ended up in a bunch of different civilizations. So they would argue that the biblical story, which Moses didn't write till about 1450 BC, is based on Gilgamesh and these other stories. They're all modified versions of the same story. Yes?
Can you just reiterate or talk a little bit about records that were preserved from before the flood?
Yeah, so the question is about records that were preserved before the flood. So it's a great question. So first of all, we have no idea what Noah brought on the boat at all. So we take that out. But of course, there were cities at the time. There was a flood, and then the flood, declined. And we actually do have archaeological discoveries like this that predate the flood, right? So there are a bunch, well, not a bunch, but there are, in the Mesopotamian region, archaeological discoveries that predate what you would think of as a traditional flood. Again, was it 3,000, 5,000 BC? We don't know, but last week we looked at one relic that dated to about 10,000 BC. So we have found stuff that have existed prior to the flood itself, which I think is kind of cool. Yep.
Silly question, but have you been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky?
I have not been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. Have you been?
No.
Anybody been there to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? It's ironic because my wife her extended family's from Kentucky, so but we don't get back there a whole lot. But no, I haven't. It's supposed to be a life-size version of the Ark, and again, the fascinating thing for me about the Ark is, again, from an engineering point of view, God gives him the dimensions, and it turns out those are just about the perfect dimensions from a nautical engineering point of view, right? Which Noah never would have known, right? But God somehow knew that would be the right dimensions for a boat that size, which I think is wonderful. I would love to know, what other instructions he gave Noah. I mean, he was building this thing for about 120 years. So, okay, let's talk about cross-beam design. Let's talk about the storage compartments. Let's talk about food storage and waste management. There's a whole bunch of stuff you need to know about building a boat like that you're going to be on for a year. So, who knows what else God kind of revealed to him. Steve?
Adding to that, God shut him in. Yeah. So Noah was walking with God during this time and perhaps did miraculous things like bring all the animals. So because of that, you can assume that Noah didn't know at all what he was doing.
Yep. Yeah, well, like I said, I think, to Steve's point, Noah didn't know what he was doing. No one's built a boat like that. I mean, we have no evidence that there was ever a boat built 5,000 BC of that size. Right? That's why it's such an unbelievable story. But, if God's there helping you and, giving you the instructions on what to build and how to build it, of course it makes sense. Yeah, no.
And I don't think there was any evidence of rain prior to that time either, was there?
So I don't know the answer to that question. There's different views on did it rain prior to Noah and did it not rain prior to Noah based on a couple of verses taken out of Genesis chapter 2. There's a debate on that. I think we talked some about that last year. And some people would argue, young earth creationists would argue there was sort of a canopy of water, and that's why people lived longer, and then it collapsed, and that's what caused the flood. There's debate on that point. Right? What we do know is the Bible says it rained, and water came up from underneath the earth in springs, right? So you're getting it from the top, you're getting it from down below, and anyway, so no question that God could have flooded the earth if he wanted to, given water below and water above. But we don't know, I don't know at least, what the world looks like prior to Noah in terms of rain. Yeah?
People didn't survive the flood, but culture did.
Mm-hmm.
And the culture must have rapidly become just as corrupt as the one that was destroyed. Our sinful nature was not destroyed. What is the study, or what do people say about that?
Yeah, so the question is, so the question is, did God accomplish anything with the flood? And this goes to what I see as the recurring theme throughout the entire Bible. And I'll kind of end on this point. We are not God's first created beings. Let's be clear. God created the angels, before us. Okay, and then the angels rebelled, and this is how you end up seeing Satan show up in Genesis chapter 2. So we are not his first created beings. There was at least one other before us, which was the angelic beings that existed, and they rebelled. So what did God do? I want to have a right relationship with my kids. I'm going to create a new set of people, Adam and Eve. I'm going to have a special relationship with them, and we're going to have this close relationship. What happened? Adam and Eve sinned, and the world got so bad that God had to destroy the whole earth in the flood and start again. Noah, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to have a right relationship with you, and we're going to have this right relationship. Noah's grandson leads a rebellion against God, went to the Tower of Babel, and we sort of know what happens there. So what happens after that? God says, okay, I promise I'm not going to destroy the earth. I'm going to select a group of people, and I'm going to have a chosen people. And they're going to be my people, I'm going to be their God, I'm going to have a right relationship with you. And he does, the people of Israel. But then we know what happens. The people of Israel, the whole Old Testament is about how they rebel. And then what does God do? He says, I'm going to send a Savior. And I'm going to create a new group of people called the church, which is going to be following believers in me, and I'm going to create a group of people that have a close relationship with me. But then if you study prophecy, what happens at the end of the church age? Nothing good. We're going to do a series on prophecy, I think, in the spring here at the church. The world does not end well. It doesn't get Christianized. It goes downhill, ends up in apostasy. It gets so bad that Jesus has to return again and basically destroy Satan and his armies, Armageddon, horrible time. I'm going to start again. Christ's kingdom on earth. Christ will be here himself, and he will rule for 1,000 years, if you believe a literal millennium. And I'm going to have a right relationship with my people, and everybody going into the millennium is Christian. But then there's these 6 little verses at the end of Revelation, where there's a big rebellion at the end of that 1,000 years. And then he destroys the earth and creates a new heaven and a new earth. And he does this 6 times, and the 7th time, which is the new heaven, new earth, is perfect. And the Bible says there'll be no sin, and it'll go for eternity. So I see this recurring theme in the Bible over and over and over again. God creating or selecting a group of beings that he wants a good relationship with. He wants fellowship. But that group of beings rebelling against him. It would be like if my first son said, Dad, I'm never going to talk to you again. I mean, one of our friends, their kids kind of wrote him off, and he hasn't talked to their kid in 3 or 4 years. That would kill me. I love my kids. But kind of makes sense then that I might invest my time in my other kid. Right? And again, I realize I'm anthropomorphizing God here. So that's probably not a good thing to do. Like, I can't read God's mind. But I totally get it. God wants one thing. He wants a direct relationship with us and fellowship. And if we reject him, he's going to go and try and have a relationship with people who won't reject him. And this is the theme we see time and time again. So what did Noah's Ark do? It allowed God to start again and create a fellowship with people. But people have free will, and people rebel. And this is the theme. Mankind ultimately is sinful, and that's why we need a Savior. Let me end on that point. Dear God, thank you so much for your word, the truths you reveal to us. We praise you, Father, for these kind of archaeological discoveries that give us confidence in our faith, but more importantly, we praise you for who you are, and we pray that you would help us have that direct fellowship with you. Amen.